Pokemon's villains are kind of weird, aren't they? In most Pokemon games, the main villain is the driving force of its plot and themes, and while they can often be memorable, a lot of Pokemon's villains can feel rather simple as characters. Now, a simple villain isn't a bad thing. In fact, a lot of great stories are effective because they have a very simple and entertaining bad guy. And Pokemon is no stranger to this concept, where most of its most iconic villains are iconic precisely because they're just easy and fun to hate. But to me, the best villains tend to be the ones where you can see as grounded and real people. Ones that you can understand on some level, even if you disagree with their motivations and actions. And that grounded, more understandable nature of villains has been something Pokemon has lacked for a while. But one Pokemon villain in particular broke away from that mold entirely, fully becoming a truly nuanced and compelling person beyond just being the game's antagonist. And this is due to one main reason. That reason being humanization. Humanization in writing is when a story adds scenes or traits that inject more human qualities onto a character, obviously. This is generally done to help create the impression of that character being a more rounded and nuanced individual. Notably, humanizing elements and scenes of a story don't usually have a direct impact on the plot, as they exist more so to ground the character in the audience's mind. These are the kinds of scenes that tell us who a character is outside of what connects them specifically to the story. A good way to find out if a character has been humanized well is if you can ask stuff like, what are their likes and interests? How would this character act on a regular day outside of the series events of the plot? Just what kind of person are they when they're not dealing with some immediate conflict? I could phrase this idea in as many ways as I want, but I think it'll come across the best if I give a direct example. And you'll have to forgive me for going on a tangent already in a video where I haven't even gotten to the main point yet, but bear with me. Season 2, Episode 15 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, titled The Tales of Ba Sing Se, is often considered one of the best episodes in the entire series. This is despite the fact that it doesn't advance the plot in the slightest. Even the most unnecessary feeling episodes of Avatar at least vaguely contribute to the ongoing storyline, in the sense that the gang is traveling to their next destination. That is not the case in Tales of Ba Sing Se. The characters are just hanging out in the city for a while and don't leave or do anything of particular note. That might have made a bit more sense in some of the earlier portions of the series, but what makes this episode's complete lack of plot relevance even more jarring is that it's taking place basically smack dab in the middle of perhaps the darkest arc of the entire show. For context, if you don't remember the specific episode counts of Avatar because you're not a nerd like me, Jet gets brainwashed the episode before this, and dies 2 episodes later. So why is this episode so widely beloved if it's so devoid of plot progression and so tonally inconsistent with the episodes surrounding it? The way I see it, that's because of how much this episode humanizes the main cast. It's a day in the life of these characters where they're not under the pressure of a fight or dramatic story beat. It shows us different sides to them that we don't usually see. Take Toph, for instance. Despite her being the best character, and I'll fight you on that and win, her pretty late introduction to the core cast means she's not afforded that many chances to show signs of her core personality that aren't badass bending moves and cool one-liners. This episode shows us that more personal, vulnerable side to her. I cannot say the word vulnerable. Vulnerable? This episode not only shows us the more personal side of her character, it in many ways elevates the rest of her characterization. We usually never see her feeling insecure about anything, but this episode makes it clear that's because almost all of her life, that we see at the very least, is her doing the thing that she's best at and takes the most pride in: fighting. This moment in the episode isn't just a cute and sweet scene between Toph and Katara. It in many ways changes the context of why Toph acts the way she does in other scenes. Without moments like the one we get in this episode, Toph would still be a really cool and fun character, yes, but she would feel a lot more one-dimensional than she does with this moment in context. And while it's in varying degrees, the rest of the episode does the exact same for the other characters, telling us things about them that add depth to the way they usually act, doing so by putting them into an environment where they're not forced to do something specific. And that's actually pretty basic psychology when you think about it. When you're not forcing someone to do something, you'll end up seeing the kinds of things that they get up to when they're just being themselves, when they're making decisions based on what they want, what they feel like doing. Obviously, the strongest example of this is the Tale of Iroh, which already has tons of analysis on it alone, so I didn't want to detail it too much here, but I felt like the segment would be incomplete without me at least mentioning it. So, to not beat a dead horse, is it beating a dead horse if I'm being positive? Never heard of that before. Anyways, the way that this scene recontextualizes every other scene with Iroh just demonstrates how important humanization can be. And what's notable is that, again, this scene doesn't really tell us anything new about Iroh that wasn't mentioned somewhere else in the series. We already knew that he lost his son during the 100-Year War, and that changed a huge amount of his perspective on life, and that he now views Zuko as his own son as a result. But this scene demonstrates the depths to which Iroh's emotional turmoil has really affected his actions. It really says so much more about Iroh that we wouldn't fully understand if we didn't have this down-to-earth scene where he just went about his day. But of course, this is a Pokemon video, not an Avatar video, so I should probably really get to the point again, sorry about that. That's humanization. And humanization is what elevates characters from being one-note plot devices meant to demonstrate basic personality traits into being fully three-dimensional people. And while not all stories need every character to be so multifaceted, it can certainly create a greater sense of investment in the character in question. Because we, as humans, we are multifaceted. There's more to us than just our jobs or abilities. It just makes a character way more compelling when you feel like you can understand the type of person that they are on multiple levels. And this is especially the case for villains, who often ignore when it comes to humanization. And in my opinion, that's a really big shame, because villains are the ones driving the conflict, often opposing the world around them. So the idea of trying to understand them as people is a lot more interesting, because it often challenges the characters and in turn the viewer's perception of morality. As a writer, you really have to challenge the mindset of both the viewers and yourself in order to write a villain that functions as an antagonist, but is also sympathetic. And that brings me to my overall point, because the thing is, most Pokemon villains, even the really well-written ones, aren't humanized much. Towards the beginning, this could be excused more so by hardware limitations, because, it's a little difficult to derive a lot of nuanced emotion and reaction out of just, 3 pixels. And it's not like Pokemon villains were poorly written up to that point, they were just really simple, as I said before. But even the villains that tried to be a little more dynamic than that kind of fell flat because they lacked this element of humanization. I'd say the biggest offender of this is actually Cyrus from the Gen 4 games. I think the idea behind Cyrus is really cool and really interesting, and he has a lot of potential lore background that makes him a compelling character to think about, but he's really not that interesting when it comes to the actual story of the game, because he's so one note. He has no real personality. There's no real person behind the idea, it's just nothing there. But more recent Pokemon games have been improving in this area a lot with their villains. Luzumini from Sun and Moon, for example, while she still acts like a crazy evil stepmother, has an emotional core to her actions through her backstory. And there's Guzma from the same game, who is arguably one of the most human and compelling Pokemon characters ever, even if calling him the main antagonist of his game is a little charitable. Even AI Sada and Turo from Scarlet and Violet have humanizing elements in their desire to break from their programming, even showing some affection for Arven. Crazy to think that they gave humanizing traits to what are literal machines. But even with these attempts at more emotionally complex Pokemon villains, there's a lack of that level of humanization I've been referring to when it comes to the scenes we actually engage with them in. For example, with Luzumine, as I said, she has a sympathetic backstory, but no elements of that are ever shown in her expressions, shown in her behaviors. When it comes to how she's presented in the cutscenes of the game, she may as well be another one of those one-note simple evil bad guys. And we just don't get many scenes to interact with Sada and Toro, period, frankly, which I get is kind of the point regarding the twist of their characters, but it just feeds into this idea that we really don't get a lot of scenes to interact with these villains as people, something that could make them feel a lot more human and a lot more interesting. Now, don't get me wrong, these are still extremely compelling villains who work really well for the stories that they're designed around. But I'm just saying, they could be so much more compelling if we got that level of humanization through the actual cutscenes of the game, and not lore background that we had to search for to find that didn't factor into the cutscenes, or were entirely relegated to after a certain twist happening. The term show don't tell really comes into play here. They're telling us about these humanizing traits of these characters, but very rarely showing them to us, which makes it less dynamic and less compelling. Now, to conclude my point, I just want to re-clarify this. I know I've said it a couple times already, but I really want to make sure that this is heard. I'm not saying any of the prior Pokemon villains were badly written. I dislike a few of them, don't get me wrong, but if you can come up with a strong argument as to why you think they were well written, I'd absolutely love to hear it, put it in the comments. But my point is that what they're lacking is not necessarily good writing. What they're lacking is humanizing scenes. Scenes where the nuanced elements of their characters and personalities are shown in their interactions. Scenes like I referred to regarding the Tales of Ba Sing Se. Scenes that just tell us about these characters in a low-stakes environment to make their later actions more compelling and nuanced. And you might notice that there's one Pokemon villain from one generation set of games that I've been ignoring up to this point, and that's because they are the exception. This humanizing element that I've been referring to is the most expressed in possibly Pokemon's most hated villain. This video is about Chairman Rose, and why I think he's actually the best written Pokemon villain we have ever gotten. Now, I'm not by any means saying that if you don't think Rose is an amazing villain by the end of this video that you're objectively wrong. But I do hope that you at the very least consider maybe challenging your perception of Rose's character and rethinking what you might have considered to be poor writing in the past as being more so intentional. And if you've never played Sword and Shield, or if you've never played a single Pokemon game and don't know who Rose is, firstly, how did you get through the first section of this video? And secondly, cool. Throughout the story of Sword and Shield, we get to see different sides of Rose's personality and how he acts. Even right from the first scene, there's a lot being done to implant a certain impression about the type of person that he is. And I really do mean the first scene. Hitting start on the intro screen to a fresh playthrough of Sword and Shield shows you a video sharing site owned by Macros Cosmos, the company Rose owns and is in charge of. And then the first character we see on screen is Rose himself, as he's about to deliver a speech regarding the world of Pokemon. Now, not 15 seconds into the game, and there's already many elements about the situation and this character that feels distinctly weird. The most obvious one here is that this is the first time in the entire series that this whole world of Pokemon speech has been delivered by someone that wasn't a professor. This speech is a common staple of Pokemon as a franchise that most people with even a single experience with the games is well aware of. But before Sword and Shield, it was always delivered by a professor, typically but not always the main professor of that game. And while Scarlet and Violet would later extend this to Clavel, giving this speech to Rose of all characters is a lot stranger in retrospect, given that he's ostensibly the game's main villain. even if it's not something the player will be immediately aware of on a fresh playthrough, there's a seed of doubt being placed about Rose's sincerity at this moment. And that is actually a huge moment of humanization. The way this scene plays out in context has the player wondering about Rose's intentions, whether he's actually being honest about what he's saying compared to how he feels. The game has not even really started yet, and the player is already prompted to consider the intentions, inner thoughts, and personality of its core antagonist based entirely on how he acts and behaves in this scene. Now, you might be thinking that I'm extrapolating way too much on this very basic scene, and I mean, like, I'm not even close to being done, so we'll talk about that later. But you have to understand that the developers made the active decision to introduce Rose to us in this way. They didn't have to do this. There's already a professor character in the game perfectly suited to giving the speech in Magnolia, who lives with a Yamper that's a lot closer to a mascot of Sword and Shield than the Q font that Rose releases. But they chose to have Rose do this, and make this the scene the basis for the player's first impression of the character. Now, the first proper interaction the player gets with Rose occurs during the intro ceremony to the gym challenge, and this scene paints him in largely the same way that the intro did. He's a well-suited businessman who, while somewhat friendly on the surface, feels like he's trying to hide something. This scene is a lot more traditional in the sense of how it lays out the foundation for Rose's role in the story. But later comes one of his, in my opinion, most interesting appearances in Hulbury, where in complete opposition to his poised, clean presentation we've seen up to this point, we see Rose, decked out in a tracksuit, ball cap, sunglasses, and spotted underwear, acting like a child when Oleana doesn't let him sign autographs. The reason this scene and how Rose is portrayed here is so important is that it does the thing I won't shut up about. It humanizes Rose. It's a goofy scene. His getup is something most wouldn't be caught dead in when in public, yet he doesn't even acknowledge it. It gives Rose a much more light-hearted tone to his personality that nonetheless feels a bit off-putting. This side of Rose is also shown much later in the story during the chase for Leon, where Rose decides to play a weird little silly game with the player in Hop, where Rose and Leon are having a conversation on the top of the tower, and Macros Cosmos is just kind of giving us the runaround. The tone of the whole affair doesn't really feel all that maniacal, it's just kind of jovial and weird. And there's the thing, being jovial and weird makes Rose more endearing, but it's also much more pertinent to the theme of his character. Imagine if Rose otherwise acted completely normally in all of these scenes, had he come to Hulbury in his business clothes for example, or hadn't played a quote-unquote game with the player in Hop trying to find Leon. It would make Rose feel less human, more just a face to drive the conflict of the climax. Rose needs to have moments like this because part of the whole point of his story is this interplay with his humanity and his ambitions. At his core, Rose is just a normal guy, not unlike most anyone else. He's a highly accomplished CEO who's made massive innovations across the region, both in his own isolated efforts and through his company. And despite all of that, he still manages to be a silly and off-putting weirdo. It adds a dimension of nuance to his character that makes him feel like more than just a one-note bad guy. He's a full human being. One with some negative traits that we'll go into more detail later, but also one with positive traits that make it understandable as to why people would like him and want to follow and support him. Now, this might be one of the more controversial statements I make in this video, but I believe that this is part of why Rose is a better handled villain in this regard at least than Ghetsis. Because Ghetsis is also presented as this big cult of personality type of person, using that to manipulate people into his plan. But in order to have a cult of personality, you kind of need a personality. We're not given much in the way of Ghetsis' core personality traits. He's abusive to N, he's power hungry, and he's kind of grumpy when he loses. That's not really a lot to go off of in terms of characterization. To be clear, this doesn't change the fact that Ghetsis is an extremely compelling antagonist, but it does make the idea of him manipulating a whole group of people into his big lie a lot harder to believe. And in response to that, you might say that N is the one who's supposed to be the cult of personality guy. He's the king of Team Plasma after all. And while that's somewhat true, N's not the one giving these speeches to try and draw people into Team Plasma's ideas throughout the game. The one time we see N doing something of that nature is very briefly in the intro to the game, and even there, Getsus is still doing a lot of the talking. Point here being, Getsus lacked a level of humanization that would make his ability to convince and manipulate people interesting and believable. And this isn't even just a problem with Black and White. Most of the evil teams have this weird element where it's like, why are these clearly evil, maniacal people being followed by this legion of grunts? The games really skirt by on just not explaining that element and just assuming the player will come up with the explanation themselves. I don't really know. And that's the thing with a lot of modern Pokemon games, where they do a lot better of a job explaining why the evil teams will follow their evil leader, even if the leader isn't evil necessarily. And I mean, Sword and Shield has another example of this, where Team Yell follows Marnie for understandable reasons, like you can get why they want to cheer for her. And you might not think this element is that important, but in order to invest into a story, you need to be able to believe the things about the characters that the story is trying to say. A lot of Pokemon games really rely on the idea of you being able to believe that these evil team leaders are somehow able to control this entire group of people, but they often don't do a good job of explaining how that is, explaining what about these evil team leaders makes them so easy to follow. And some of them do a good job of this. Giovanni just kind of pays his grunts, that's not that hard to believe, but a lot of them don't, like, again, Cyrus. This is why I have so much trouble really investing into Cyrus's character on the level that a lot of the fanbase does. Cyrus's whole character is based on the fact that, you know, he grew up in an emotionally neglectful household. He just disregards emotions entirely and doesn't really like talking to people. But then, like, how does someone like that have an entire legion of people ready to die for him? Like, where did we get from point A to point B there? If Cyrus's character were consistent, he'd be a complete loner, but he isn't. He's constantly followed by tons of people. It feels like there's just a bit of a mismatch with the character the game was trying to create and the character we actually experience in the game. Now, it's not like it makes no sense for anyone on Team Galactic to follow Cyrus, but part of the problem is the game already doesn't do a great job at showing us why Cyrus thinks the way he does, why he believes emotions to be a plague on society. But we still do get some explanation for that. So what about all these guys? They all agree with Cyrus's motivation, so did all of them have abusive parents too? What's the deal there? Again, it's like, you've got to be able to believe these things about the characters. Cyrus may very well be a well-written antagonist by himself, but taken in context with what the rest of the game tries to do with him, it becomes a lot harder to invest into him for me, because I keep having to ask questions like, wait, why are all of these people following him then? What's their story? Why do they want to follow a person who they're almost aware of the fact will just abandon them completely at the drop of a hat? There could be an explanation for that, but such an explanation isn't given in the game, and it's not shown through Cyrus's personality. This is why showcasing those humanizing qualities of a villain are so important, because it helps ground the rest of the narrative around them. Here's something to consider if you've largely disregarded Rose as a villain. With the exception of only Volo from Legends Arceus and Sada and Turo from Scarlet and Violet, did you know that he has the most dialogue out of almost any villain in the entire series? And even taking Volo and Sada and Turo into consideration, most of their dialogue is backloaded into the very final few cutscenes we get with them, especially in the case of Sada and Turo. Now, I'm far from saying that the technical number of words that a villain says in a story is what makes them well written. That's not the point I'm making here. What I'm saying is that when we're trying to create investing villains, or just investing characters as a whole, having more scenes that establish more distinct traits about them as characters is extremely important. Part of the core thing I'm criticizing in the other Pokemon villains is the fact that we don't get to engage with them as characters much throughout their stories. For example, I think both Cyrus and Luzumine are far more interesting characters in the anime versions of their counterparts, because we simply get more time to explore them as characters, especially with Luzumine. And they don't need to have as much screen time as like a protagonist or whatever. You can get a lot of mileage out of just a few scenes where you're actually interacting with a character or a villain. Again, it's about having that nuance, that sense of seeing someone from different perspectives. And it's because of this very human characterization in Rose that you can understand why people in the region will idolize and support Rose. Idolize him to the extent that no one, not Rose's supporters or even Rose himself, would question the less than ideal elements of his motivations. The further the story of Sword and Shield goes along, the more Rose's goofy nature starts to wane, and a different side to his personality starts to unfold. He becomes less and less interested in the actual gym challenge, and more invested in his work of providing energy to the region at all costs. Clearly the most obvious example of this is shown through the scene in Stow-Inside with Bede, where in an act that feels deliberately unfair and cold, Rose disqualifies Bede from the gym challenge. Now on a surface level, this might not seem all that odd. Rose endorsed Bede and as such can't be associated with him causing so much property damage, especially seeing as Rose never actually told Bede to do anything like this. But what's important here is Rose's dialogue and just how swiftly he makes this decision. He only just found out about what Bede did, yet he makes up his mind beyond any chance of discourse about disowning him within seconds. He knows by this point that Bede cares a lot about proving his worth to him, and as the person who sponsored him for the gym challenge, you'd think Rose would see this as something important. But over the course of a few cold, unemotional sentences, Rose just disregards all of that and leaves Bede seemingly completely alone with no support at all. No room for compromise, not even attempting to see Bede's side in all of this. Just a flat abandonment of him entirely. It might have made more sense if this was presented as, like, a common occurrence. If Bede was known to act against Rose's wishes before. But as far as we're told, this is the one and only time Bede ever did anything to upset Rose, and it wasn't even by his intention. But Rose disowns him anyway. This is a far cry from the caring, goofy guy who just wanted to sign autographs for his fans back in Hulbury, even if he has consistently shown little care for Bede up to now. It speaks to a lack of emotional understanding and empathy on Rose's part to so nonchalantly crush the dreams of a boy he basically adopted. He tosses Bede aside more like a used tool than a human being. And before we move on, I want to address a few lines that stuck out to me a lot here. Firstly, the one from Rose where he says that Bede reminded him of himself when he was young. Now, think about that and what it's actually implying. Bede is this stubborn, self-centered, stuck-in-his-own mindset kind of kid who is unable to see any of his peers as worthy of being in his presence half the time. Rose seeing that, and being reminded of himself when he was young, what does that say about Rose? What does that imply about the kind of kid that he was, about the kind of person that he was? Even if he didn't mean for it to come across that way, this really does say a lot about Rose's personality. Bede is stubborn and closed-minded, therefore, Rose must have been similar, and in all probability still is to some extent. And then there's the other line from Bede, where he expresses how Rose is just not considering any kind of other viewpoint. At this point, this line doesn't tell us anything that I haven't already directly referred to, or will refer to later, but it does go a long way in telling us that Rose's unsympathetic and frankly irrational disregard for any compromise, or even listening to any decision that isn't his own, those are all intentional parts of his character. Stuff that the game is self-aware of. And it's just, kind of a point to say that I'm not looking too far into things, because it's literally written into the dialogue that Rose is really irrational and unreasonable sometimes. And while his decision to disqualify Bede may not seem irrational at first, this disregard for the humanity of the situation continues to get more and more dangerous as the story goes along. Further into the game, while not directly linked to Rose until later on, wild Pokemon randomly Dynamax and go on a rampage, endangering many civilians. This is eventually revealed to be the results of experiments Rose enacted. There's the lack of empathy again. This time going beyond the small scale of crushing the dreams of one boy, and into the active endangerment of entire crowds of people. At this point, Rose cares so little for the lives of the people currently living in the region that he's actively using the land their homes are built on as a lab bench. All of this culminates in the final tourney for the gym challenge, and notably, Rose is nowhere to be seen. He doesn't show up on the pitch, he doesn't make another speech, he's just not present, despite being the one giving his voice to introduce the gym challenge beforehand, and being the guy running the whole thing. And that's because he doesn't care about it. Not anymore. You could say that Rose's character arc over the course of the game is watching him go from warm and kind to cold and analytical. It all becomes clear during his conversation with Leon, where Rose explains that his plan is to harness the Eternatus' power for the sake of giving the region an endless supply of energy to avoid a crisis that'll take place 1,000 years from now, if nothing is done to prevent it. Now, this scene is where Rose's character and the writing behind him tends to lose a lot of people. The criticism here being that the idea that Rose would be so irrational and so impatient as to not be able to wait a single day to enact his plan doesn't feel like it was built up to at all. The idea that, there's been other irrational Pokemon villains in the past, but we already knew that they were irrational, so... It makes more sense when they do it, I guess. I don't fully understand this criticism, actually. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. The point here being is that people don't feel like the character of Rose we see at the end of the game reflects the character of Rose we see at the beginning of the game. But is that really true? Have we not been seeing, over the course of the game, scenes that humanize Rose and characterize him as a goofy but rather irrational and kind of impatient person? This is why humanizing villains can be so compelling. Because you can take a character that, on a first glance, doesn't seem that evil at all. But over the course of the game, we see scenes that hint to this deeper flaw in the personality of Rose. This impatience, this irrationality, this pettiness. And all of them lead to further implications about his character that I'm going to go over in the rest of this video. Furthermore, what I think a lot of people missed about this conversation on Rose Tower was the ideological battle of what was more important to the region that took place between Rose and Leon. Not a battle of Pokemon, but a battle of ideologies. Leon believed that the Gym Challenge's finale was more important than Rose's plan, while Rose felt that saving the future of the region was more important than caring about a few silly battles. Rose's ability to empathize and understand the people around him has gone out completely, and now that's resulted in him not being able to compromise on his plans. He wasn't able to compromise for Bede, he wasn't able to compromise for the people endangered by his experiments, and now he's unable to compromise for Leon. His humanity has dissipated. A common criticism of Rose by Pokemon fans is that, despite being the main villain, he doesn't really do anything truly villainous, at least to the player's knowledge, until the final moments of the story. The point here being that Rose doesn't have much of a presence as an antagonist, because he only really operates as a villain in the final act. And this is admittedly where earlier Pokemon villains tended to shine more than the modern ones, as they are more actively villainous and cause more problems across the region that the player directly encounters, whether by the villain's own hands or through their grunts. There, the player felt a more consistent sense of tension and struggle against a wide-reaching force, which is an effective device to drive investment in taking these villains down. And admittedly, that sense of constant and direct tension isn't felt as actively with Rose specifically, but there is a reason for that, and I have a lot to say about the ways Sword and Shield makes up for this difference, but I'll save a good portion of that for a later video. For now, while it is true that the game isn't as in-your-face with the impact of Rose's actions, I think that most players completely missed a lot of the details that make Rose a lot more dangerous and intimidating than they might have realized. And all of it is put through the world building. To put things simply, the region of Galar has been suffering. In fact, it might be the region most negatively affected by human actions that we've ever seen in the series. And Rose has done nothing but contribute to this. In fact, he might be the leading cause of it. First, let's go over a few examples. Do you remember this gem of a fella? It's a Corsola, specifically its counterpart that's native to Galar. It's far from the only regional form of a Pokemon, but something about it is off. Reading its Dex entry, we get this interesting sentence. Sudden climate change wiped out this ancient kind of Corsola. Climate change. That's oddly specific. And not just any old climate change either, sudden climate change. As in a change that was unexpectedly quick. Now that's not something we've heard a lot of in the Pokemon world, is it? And that's not the only example. Really paying attention to the Galarian form Pokemon, you get a consistent theme that differentiates them from the Alolan and Paldean forms we see in other games. Because the Galar ones changed in pretty odd ways. In Alola and Paldea, the differences present in the unique forms of Pokemon that existed in other regions were generally positive or at the very least neutral changes. In fact, in some cases the alternate forms were implied to be the more natural forms of these Pokemon, like with Elon Executor growing to a much larger size than its Kanto counterpart thanks to the sunnier climate in Alola. In general, these forms are the result of good or at least not negative impacts of the region's climate. However, the Galarian form Pokemon have a trend of suffering from Galar's climate, and being forced to adapt to it in sometimes painful ways. Galarian Zigzagoon, for example, was stated to have evolved into Obstagoon due to its survival instinct being honed from competition in harsh conditions from the Galar region. And the Dex entry for the non-Galarian Zigzagoon in Sword and Shield specifically states that, due to the better climate of other regions, it adapted to them becoming more peaceful and friendly, to the point where it didn't even need to evolve. Basically an inverse of the Corsola situation. A Pokemon that was originally native to Galar, at least in the lore, had a much harsher and hardened nature, even evolving to a further state because of it. But once it was moved outside of Galar, it became more relaxed and more peaceful. Now what does that say about Galar's climate exactly? There's even more examples of this. Galarian Darumaka, cold weather causes Fire Sac to atrophy, forcing it to become a snow boy. Galarian Weezing changed its form due to air pollution. Are you seeing the trend now? Even the Galarian forms that are less obviously the results of negative climate change have details that nonetheless lean in the same direction, implying a harsher and more hostile environment in this region. All of these forms of Pokemon that are unique to Galar are explicitly the result of negative impacts of the region's climate, adaptations they adopted out of necessity. And I mean, sure, one Pokemon description like this wouldn't mean too much. Magcargo infamously is as hard on the surface of the sun according to its Dex entry, so one of these things by itself without any supporting context doesn't say a whole lot. But this is more than just a single weirdly phrased Pokédex entry. all of these changes are adaptations caused by Galar's uniquely bad climate. It was written out specifically for Galarian versions of Pokemon that have already existed in past regions. Again, the regional forms we see from Alola and Paldea do not have such descriptions that indicate negative climate impacts on the region, especially not name-dropping very specific environmental effects like climate change and pollution. That's a bit too coincidental. Galar has a climate change problem. I think it's pretty clear that the intention of the developers is that Galar's climate is overall worse than that of most regions. And I mean, come on, this is the only region in the entire series where there's actual honest-to-God pollution happening in major facilities across the region, some of which the narrative directly points to. And if you still somehow aren't convinced that there's a climate change issue in Galar, think about what climate change is generally caused by in our real world. Mining, for example. Not to turn this into a 6th grade science lesson, but pretty much our biggest contributor to global warming over history is coal mining. We mine coal from the ground and burn it in order to generate electricity. That generates greenhouse gases like CO2, which warms the planet to a detrimental extent, which is what causes rapid and damaging climate change. Now, I know this is probably a massive stretch, right? Like, in order to prove that this is both what is happening in the Galar region and that Rose is involved with it, the game would have to have a scene where Rose literally shows the player a full-blown diagram of how he primarily generates electricity by burning a fuel source that his company mines. That would be some pretty overt social commentary that directly criticizes real-world corporations and big tech CEOs for the way they sacrifice our planet for the sake of making as much energy as feasibly possible. And I was told that Sword and Shield is a dumb baby game for kids with bad writing, so it can't possibly have things like themes and social commentary, right? Right. Oh, wait, there it is, right there. It literally could not be more in your face about it, and yet in all of the discussion I've engaged with regarding Sword and Shield's narrative, I've seen basically no one point this out. Honestly, it fits perfectly. England is one of the world's biggest contributors to pollution over history, to the extent that bad weather and smog is commonly associated with the nation. Then, when designing Galar, which is supposed to be modeled after England, the developers would be smart to implement that aspect as well. Heck, in this generation, they literally introduced the coal mining Pokemon, which is primarily used by Rose's employees in the mining facilities that he runs. Any notion that wishing stones aren't meant to be an explicit metaphor for coal kind of flies out the window there. And Rose is the one behind the pollution at the heart of this. He is the one causing the region to suffer for the sake of what he deems as progress. More energy, more power, nothing matters except his motivations. This even applies to the people living in Galar. We already went over how Rose endangers the lives of Galarians by causing wild Pokemon to Dynamax as a result of his experiments, but as I've been pointing out, Rose's disregard for the negative impact of his actions did not start with his plan to awaken Eternatus. Take the city of Spikemuth, one of the biggest longtime victims of Rose's machinations. The city is led by Piers, who, understandably, opposes a lot of Rose's ideas, shown in his refusal to use Dynamax as a part of his battles. And I don't know about you, but having the punk rock gym leader be the one who was against the bigwig CEO destroying the environment kind of feels like there's something to that, isn't there? Isn't there? Or is it just me? Am I the only one seeing any of this? Okay. But anyways, remember that Dynamaxing Pokemon is actually tied to Galar as a region in a very physical ways. Pokemon can only Dynamax using special bands made from wishing stars, bands that Rose is all too ready to brag about were made by his company. But that's not all. Even with a Dynamax band, you can only Dynamax a Pokemon in specific locations, like the wells scattered throughout the region. And every stadium in Galar, built by Rose's company again, is built over one of these spots, in order to allow for Dynamaxing to occur in gym battles. Spikemuth is a little different, however. Piers doesn't use Dynamaxing in his gym at all. And the explanation for why is actually seated in a deep conflict between him and Rose. See, Rose wanted to move the Spikemouth Gym somewhere far away from the city itself, to which Piers refused, insisting he'd rather just not use Dynamax in battle than basically abandon the city that raised him and his sister. And this ended up causing Spikemouth to become far less visited by fans and turn into the poor and cramped area it is when the player arrives. Yet again, Rose's disregard for the people actually living in the region that he says he wants to help or save comes in, this time being a conflict between culture and progress. You could have very easily supported Spikemouth regardless of its willingness to integrate Dynamaxing, but instead, he simply just left it to rot, all because Piers wouldn't abide by his very specific methods. All of this is to point out how, despite the seeming lack of villainy outside of the finale of the game, Rose's actions have been damaging Galar in subtle but very notable ways. It demonstrates the true personal flaw of Rose's character that makes him into what is actually one of the most effective villains in the franchise at representing a mindset that connects to our real world, as well as criticizing that mindset. So, there's a certain term that exists which permeates much of the point I've been trying to make in this analysis that I should probably explain in more detail. It's called Longtermism. While it may sound pretty self-explanatory, it's not generally a term you hear often, despite how prevalent it is in our world. Longtermism is, in a nutshell, an ethical stance that prioritizes the future over the present. You can already probably tell how this connects to Rose, you could even say this is the core theme of his character, but there's more to it than just that connection. In practice, long-termism is a common mindset and stance taken by obscenely rich people as an attempt at altruism. As individuals with more money than most of the population will ever earn combined and multiplied, these types of people have a certain mindset about the world and their role in it. They tend to view themselves as being saviors, and that all of their actions are justified when it comes to the bigger picture. Even if those actions make no sense, are actively harmful to everyone around them, or both. Usually it's that last option. I'm not going to make this a huge diatribe about rich people, but if you are interested in that sort of thing, I'd recommend some of these videos that go into more depth on how wealth actually negatively affects the mindsets of the wealthy. A lot of these basically also inspired this entire section of my video, so I really would recommend checking them out. But to sum it up, there are some common characteristics of the ultra-wealthy that result in them following this long-termism mindset. A desire for intimate and social connections they can't normally obtain due to the position their wealth creates. A severe and often destructive lack of empathy for those around them. A highly warped sense of their own superiority and merit. And an often narcissistic desire to advance civilization into the future, but in ways that only seem to emphasize their own personal legacy. In a lot of ways, this can be summed up as these individuals thinking the real world around them is a video game, with them being the player character and everyone else being NPCs instead of real human beings. There's obviously a lot more to get to these points, but again, if you're interested in learning more about this topic specifically, go watch some of those videos that I mentioned. So now some of you may be thinking, hey, weren't you talking about the funny polka dot underwear Pokemon bad guy? What does all this psychology crap have to do with anything? But do keep in mind that Rose is very clearly meant to invoke your average big tech CEO. His character arc and downfall are, in many ways, inspired by how being in that position of wealth and influence negatively impacts one's psyche, relationships, and their sense of basic logic. Those points I laid out earlier are all shown in Rose explicitly in some way. That desire for social connections that he can't normally obtain, shown in his almost childlike desire to acquire autographs from young fans. A severe and often destructive lack of empathy. That much is self-evident given his experiments putting the people of Galar in danger, and his lack of overall empathy for Bede. A belief that it's impossible for him to be wrong, that because he's had success in the past, anything he tries will work on the basis of his merit and nothing else? Well, Rose tries to repeat an event literally called the Darkest Day, because he thinks he's smart and good enough to deal with the repercussions of doing so. So, yeah. And that narcissistic desire to advance civilization motivated more so by self-interest? Well, while it might not seem as obvious, this one is extremely prevalent in Rose once you peel back the layers of his behavior and realize that all of these actions are motivated by Rose's ego. In fact, Rose's entire fall from grace can be seen as a destructive and arrogant savior complex. Again, if you're aware of how ultra-rich tech CEOs tend to behave and view the world around them, this mindset that I'm describing will be incredibly familiar to you. These people tend to believe that having more money than any normal person could ever dream of should give them full control of their environment. They have all these resources and advantages, so you would think that they'd be able to get anything that they wanted. Except that isn't really the case in practice, is it? That's why that level of wealth can actually be severely damaging to the brain. That sense of control you'd assume someone like that to have is rarely as all-encompassing as it might seem. Look at any interview with or article about Elon Musk, for example, regarding his personal life in some capacity, and you'll see not a boss with the world at his fingertips, but just a guy who's lost any sense of social empathy, desperately wanting some form of connection to others and some kind of meaning to his life. Why else do you think the guy makes all these desperate bids for attention that tank his own reputation more than anything?
I think another reason Elon hates wokeness is because he has very clear ideas of what he wants to do. His goals are to make humanity multiplanetary and to preserve human consciousness. Basically, save the world, but with the concrete goal of moving some people to another place. He's also an industrialist and a capitalist who needs to constantly grow and generate profit and value while pursuing these lofty goals of his. People who are woke, whether that means pro-union or anti-racism or pro-regulation, are simply in his way. And he has no problem crushing people who are in his way. Indeed, you can have lofty pro-human goals and still do bad things and have bad ideas. Even he knows this. You can have pro-human aims with anti-human practices. Often his pro-humanity and sympathies seem really tacked on, like lip service.
In many ways, Rose is the exact same as someone like Elon Musk. That could be my thesis right there, honestly. Rose is a commentary on Elon Musk. Send tweet. Or X post, or you get the gist. Rose wants control. He wants to be loved. He wants to be the sole savior of the region. And that desire becomes more clawing and desperate the longer he doesn't get those things. This is why his conversation with Leon goes south. Why he completely abandons Leon's attempt at a compromise. It's not that Rose wouldn't have been willing to wait a few days to enact his plan. That wasn't the point of why he disagreed. It's that he didn't want Leon to be the one calling the shots. He didn't want Leon to be the one in control of his actions. This is his plan to save the region, his chance at getting all of that glory and cementing his legacy forever. This right here is the core thing I think people just did not catch when it came to understanding why Rose was written the way he was. Rose's goal to save Galar's supposed energy crisis is technically a good motivation, a desire to further human progress by removing the limitations on how much energy can be produced. You could even see how it might have started from a place of genuine concern at some point. But due to the way Rose has been blinded by success, both the success he's had and future success he wants to acquire, that genuine goal becomes nothing more than a front for Rose's own desire to be adored. By the time he's enacted his plan to bring about the Darkest Day, this whole situation is no longer about what's best for the world. Longtermism is not an inherently evil or poor ideology. If anything, it's good to want to refuse immediate gratification for the sake of long-term benefits, But when it's poisoned by these very human failings, that's where things fall apart. Furthermore, in the prior section, I pointed out how Rose's goals of, quote, progress, and further advancing Galar by generating more energy from wishing stars, has already damaged the region and those living in it in various ways. Rose thinks that having endless wishing stars will be enough to save the region 1,000 years into the future, but his plan doesn't account for the damage caused in the present. Again, to him, it's a matter of worthwhile sacrifice. But the sacrifice here is human lives and safety. And when you think about how a lot of the ultra-wealthy behave, yeah, Rose's behavior seems less unrealistic and more a darkly accurate portrayal of how this kind of disconnect leads to complete irrationality. I'm gonna be perfectly real here. Part of the thing that's been making working on this project for so long both funny and frustrating has been watching people's stances on Rose shift as a result of real-world tech CEOs showing their true colors. That criticism of Rose that such a successful and accomplished man would never become so irrational and short-sighted has basically completely dissipated. Which is cool in the sense that it shows how ahead of its time Sword and Shield's story was, but annoying in the sense that we had to watch a bunch of idiots try to destroy the world to get to that realization. Should really stop inserting some political opinions into this first video I've ever made. That's probably not a good idea. Anyways. And I mean, be real for a moment. If Elon Musk found a creature that could give the world an infinite supply of coal energy, do you think he wouldn't try the same thing Rose is doing? No, he'd also want to take advantage of this opportunity to make sure that he gets more attention and praise, denying anyone trying to tell him otherwise. He'd assume that simply having all of that wealth meant that he was automatically more worthy and deserving of praise and admiration. I mean, that is something that a lot of people believe. That having wealth means that you clearly did something to earn all of that wealth. Even when you didn't. Again, political opinion, sorry. But the important thing to make note of here is how these mindsets are not born from nowhere. It's not as if people like Rose or Elon Musk are just born with the desire to cause so much damage. Again, long-termism is not an inherently evil ideology, but often a misguided one. People in these positions are obligated to look at things on a big picture level. They try to make these inventions and innovations that are meant to push humanity forward. But when you try to push humanity forward, you can't forget your own humanity.
And that really sums up long-termism, the idea that we need to focus on some far-off utopian fantasy to the point that we ignore or even abuse the world right in front of us. After all, what's a few dead monkeys, or 1,500 other dead animals, or massive worker layoffs, or even a climate catastrophe, when the goal is to have space colonies and immortalize the human race?
As I said earlier, the thing that poisons Rose's altruistic goals are his human flaws and biases, as well as his lack of awareness of those flaws and biases. One of the biggest disconnects in how wealth can warp the mind of the wealthy is that it gives them a false sense of their own merit. Rose believes harshly in the fact that he inherently has more merit than the people around him. Merit that justifies him making decisions that will drastically affect their lives without their permission or even their knowledge. So, when someone like Leon comes along, someone who does actually have that merit that Rose wants to think he has, but really doesn't, that makes Rose desperate. He has to prove that he's the better man. He has to show the world that he's the one they should look up to, not this guy. Rose wanted to be the hero of the region. The only hero of the region. At this point, I feel an important question arises, one that'll make more sense in a bit. Basically, what is the main goal of the player in Sword and Shield? To become champion, obviously, but what does that mean specifically in this context? Well, one of the more undervalued aspects of Sword and Shield, in my opinion, is the fact that it develops aspects of the Pokemon world that, to this point, were never really given that much thought or development, such as the champion title. For example, why do gym leaders and champions in the Pokemon League exist in the first place? They were initially created for the sake of the games having boss battles like other JRPGs, but in-universe, the role of these elements has never really been questioned, until Sword and Shield. This is definitely a topic for another video, but to sum it up, Sword and Shield actually bothered to answer the question of what the point of being a gym leader, and especially a champion, is in the Pokemon world. And one of the main ways it does so is through its portrayal of Leon, and the role he takes on in the region's culture. Sure, the player wants to surpass Leon, but that's not why they're going through the effort of taking on the gym challenge. So then, what is the player character's motivation for wanting to be the champion? And I'd say, in essence, it's to become Leon, or to be someone just like him more accurately. The adoring fans he has, the recognition, the nature of being the one everyone in Galar looks up to, that inherent sense of merit that Leon has in so many ways. And if you want a less pretentious sounding version of this idea, just think of real world sports superstars like Lionel Messi, Usain Bolt, LeBron James, take your pick honestly. These are people who have attained a sense of glory due to their immense achievements, where even if you have absolutely no interest in the sports that they play, you have at least likely heard of their name and are aware of their status. And if you are invested in those sports, these people act as figures for you to look up to aspire to in some regard, even if you've never reached that level. That is who Leon is to the Galar region. The game makes it blatantly clear in every scene regarding Leon's champion status that the player should aspire to be like Leon. And not just the player. Every major character in Sword and Shield story, minus the retired folk like Opal and Magnolia, in some way want to achieve what Leon has. Hop obviously wants this, but so do the other rivals competing for the champion title. So does every gym leader. In some way or form, everyone wants to be the person that Leon is to the region. And most notably, Rose is one of those people. Someone who wants the type of status and glory that Leon has. You might think that's not evidently the case, but if you peel a few layers back, you can see this desire in Rose and the deeper causes of it that have been foreshadowed. As Rose states later in the game, he views Leon as the knight saving the princess in the castle, with Rose viewing himself as the princess in that metaphor, which is interesting for a number of reasons I'll get into later. But the point here is that Rose making this comparison reveals the deeper feelings he has towards Leon. Jealousy and envy.
Aw, man.
Rose has achieved so much in his life, and has all this wealth and influence, but even then, he doesn't quite have all the attention and fame and adoration that Leon gets from the region seemingly with ease. And this jealousy itself has a lot of potential layers. For example, while he's only a factor in the DLC, Rose's younger brother Peony is, like Leon, a more upbeat and silly doof that's all about the experience in the moment. In fact, there's a lot of similarities between Leon and Peony, the biggest one being, of course, that they were both at one point champion of Galar. You could see Rose's complex towards Leon as representative of his complex towards his brother Peony. And I think the fact that such a dynamic is so visible in Rose speaks volumes to how much effort was put into his characterization as being smart and forward-thinking, but also petty and stuck in the past in many ways. This element of Rose is also heavily supported by the fact that, in his league card, it's mentioned that Rose entered the gym challenge and got to the final tournament, only to come in second place. If that sounds familiar, it should, and we'll address that further later. But put simply, Rose wants Leon's popularity and the ability to have that profound impact on the people of the region. Leon is always characterized as someone who people just naturally seem to admire. That's what being a champion means here, that sense of glory, that legacy that you just inherently leave on the world. And despite all of his wealth and influence, that's one of the few things that Rose just can't have, which obviously makes him covet it more and more. Once again, this is just like most well-known tech CEOs, which are once again clearly Rose's inspiration. Wealth itself doesn't make someone happy, and those in Rose's position desire the few things that wealth can't buy them. This also extends to the idea of merit that I brought up earlier. Rose, like most in his position, has convinced himself that he's earned the success through his own merit. And the thing is, that could very well be true, but he's trying to assert that success onto things that go well beyond what they initially applied to. Really, it's pretty evident that there's a part of Rose that just thinks he's naturally better and more deserving of praise than what he's gotten. But yet, here's Leon, someone who succeeded specifically in the one area that Rose came in second place for. All of this is born from a desire to become Leon, in a sense. Rose wants Leon's adoring fans, shown in that scene of him being clearly upset when he's told to stop basking in the glow of signing his autograph for 2 random kids. Now compare that to the scene from earlier in the game where a crowd of people are swarming around the champion. People line the streets just to see Leon, while Rose has to chase down kids just to sign a few autographs. I'm not saying that all of Rose's actions were dictated by this jealousy. I do think he genuinely wanted what was best for the region. But what I am saying is that this jealousy corrupted what might have been initially good intentions, and that's what makes it truly compelling. Because the most ironic thing about all of this is that Rose was like Leon at one point. At the beginning of the game, Rose is arguably the closest to Leon that he ever gets. He's admired, he's giving a speech to a massive crowd, he's the man who runs the whole gym challenge everyone's so excited for. But seemingly because he's the one introducing Leon to the pitch, and not the one being introduced, it's just not enough for him. And this is why he loses his empathy and humanity over the course of the story. As his desperation to acquire what Leon has increased, his methods of acquiring it became more and more dangerous. Rose, like Leon, had a protege who basically worshipped him, who wanted nothing but to please him, to be like him. But he tossed all of that away. And now, let's bring back that question from the beginning of this section. What is the main goal of the player in Sword and Shield? To become like Leon. Just like how Rose does. In many ways, Rose is a dark mirror of the player's own motivations. He clearly wants to be like Leon, just like the player does. But for every step the player takes in getting closer to Leon, working hard to get stronger, cultivating rivalries, gaining the respect and admiration of the gym leaders one by one, Rose does the opposite. He ignores the gym challenge, he pushes away the people that admire him, eventually throwing away all the potential goodwill he had cultivated over his whole life. And that's really the core of it. In Rose's attempt to become the region's hero, he put the people of the region's lives in danger, while Leon and the player stepped up to save them, and thus ensuring that by the end, hardly anyone would admire Rose. At this point, I'm going to go over the other characters beyond Leon that connect to Rose on a thematic level. Characters that, through how they parallel Rose, help to illustrate what the story was trying to say with him. I'll start with Bede because we already touched upon him a bit, and his dynamic with Rose is a little bit simpler to comprehend, but still extremely important. Now, Bede very much falls into the category of characters that really deserve their own separate analysis if I ever get around to doing that sort of thing. So for now, I just want to talk about how Bede supports what I've said about Rose, rather than analyze his character in isolation too much. We've already addressed the very cold and detached way Rose disowns Bede and Stoincide, but what about their wider dynamic? What influence does Rose have on Bede's overall character? And how does that emphasize the points I've been making about Rose himself? Bede idolizes Rose very clearly throughout the game. In terms of a mentor, sure, but notably given his background, it's clear he also desires attention from Rose on the level that a child would from a parent or an older family member. And as such, there's a clear desire in Bede to become like Rose through embracing him as a mentor. Now, break that down for a moment. A kid who views a mentor slash family figure as someone to be put on a pedestal, who desires more than anything to be just like that person, only to eventually realize that they need to become their own person, separated from the one that they worship. That should be reminding you of another character in the game, Hop, as well as Marnie actually through her own adoration of Piers. You see, in the previous line there, I invented this cool new word called idoration, which is a combination of the words idolization and adoration. That was definitely me coming up with a cool new word to share with you, and not just me reading the word wrong, because I'm bad at this. So let's just move on and pretend I came up with a cool new word, okay? Alright, okay. Thank you. As a bit of a side tangent, all three of the rivals of Sword and Shield carry this theme of looking up to their idols, who are also the people who endorsed them to enter the gym challenge in the first place, before growing out of simply wanting to imitate them. Despite each rival being so different in personality and all of them looking up to such different people as well, they are all thematically connected to the same ideas of legacy and how to live up to what came before you, and all parallel each other on their character journeys. But Hop specifically is interesting in this case because his dynamic with Bede helps to emphasize the dynamic between Lowe's and Rion. God, I'm so good at this. But Hop specifically is interesting in this case because his dynamic with Bede helps to emphasize the dynamic between Leon and Rose that I mentioned earlier. Both of these men have one kid who looks up to them more than anyone else, and who clings to their coattails and tries to imitate their success. Both of these kids also reflect the personalities and ideologies of their respective mentors. Hop wants to follow in Leon's footsteps because he thinks Leon is the coolest, so he imitates Leon's mannerisms like through the little face slap motion they both do, as well as how they both throw their Pokeballs. And since Bede is meant to look up to Rose in similar ways, we can extrapolate a lot of characterization out of Rose through Bede's own behavior, kind of like what I hinted at before. That cocky, I'm better than everyone else attitude Bede puts on is a reflection of the type of personality he must see in Rose. Kids do imitate their idols after all, and their parental figures. And in the case of Hop and Bede, both of them are at some point faced with an obstruction that prevents them from fully following in their mentor's path. In Hop's case, it was the increasingly evident fact that he wasn't naturally skilled enough in battle to reach the same heights as his brother, something that, ironically, only really set into Hop's mind when he lost to Bede. In Bede's case, it's largely in the scene we already went over in Stow Inside, where Rose completely disowns Bede, making it impossible for him to not only participate in the gym challenge, but also impossible for him to work for Rose and follow in his footsteps. This leads the both of them into a crisis of identity, where they are eventually brought under the wings of different mentors who are better suited to bringing out their full potential. Both of which being successful women of the region, which is great for breaking down gender separation, because boys don't always need male role models and can in fact gain a lot from looking up to the accomplished women of their life, which is a really strong message about. Anyways, the point is Bede and Hop are as much mirrors of each other as Rose and Leon are, and the trajectory of their respective stories reflect the different ways their mentors view and treat them. Leon is obviously very fond and caring towards Hop. He is his brother after all. He appreciates how much Hop looks up to him and does his best to help Hop work towards his goal, in particular with how he asks the player to help Hop grow by being his rival. Rose, by contrast, does not consider Bede with much affection at all. He's cold towards him, barely remembers his presence half the time, despite Bede's constant and desperate vying for his attention. It's not that he feels any spite or disdain towards Bede either, he just doesn't feel much of anything for him. Much like the real-world business mind CEOs Rose is meant to invoke, anything that he feels won't help him achieve further progress isn't something he views as worth caring about. All of this becomes sadly ironic given how, as I mentioned earlier, Bede's adoration of Rose, being so similar to Hop's adoration of Leon, is one of the few things that made Rose similar to the champion to begin with. He had the closest thing to what he wanted right in front of him, but he was too blind to see it before he tossed it away. I don't think it's difficult to say that this is a clear case of emotional child abuse through neglect, where Rose fails to give Bede the emotional validation and attention that kids need. Even if it wasn't by his intent, Rose abused Bede through his neglect. And that's also something that's prevalent among big tech CEOs, ayo. And this further speaks to Rose's lack of empathy, developed as a result of his position as an ultra-wealthy titan who's on the cutting edge of the region's energy production. Ironically, the best thing Rose could have done for Bede in this situation was tossing him aside, allowing him to be taken in by a much healthier mentor and parental figure. And speaking of healthier parental figures, again, we've already gone over Piers a little bit, and like Bede, he really does deserve a whole analysis for himself. But after the 75th rewrite of this script, I realized that Piers really sums up a lot of the points I'm trying to make in one strong example, as well as an example that's clearly pitted against Rose thematically already. This is a brief touch on this stuff, but basically, Piers represents something similar to Leon in the sense that he is an example of the kind of mindset that Rose refused to adhere to. Like I pointed out earlier, Piers refused to capitulate to Rose's ideas of moving his gym to a different city in order to have him use Dynamax in his battles, and that resulted in a rift between Rose and Piers that is represented by Spikemuth's rundown state and disconnect from Galar as a region. And with that background in mind, you would assume that Piers would be diametrically opposed to Dynamaxing in battle in general. But then, why does Marnie use Dynamax? I've seen some people erroneously make the claim that this is Sword and Shield's writing being inconsistent, having Marnie engage in the very thing Piers refused to do, and what in some respects represents what caused the rift between Spikemuth and the rest of Galar to begin with. But that's a very shallow interpretation of these characters. Not to mention, it ignores everything Piers actually says regarding his own view on the matter. Because these characters do have, opinions that are demonstrated by their words and actions, you know? Simply put, Piers doesn't think that him refusing to use Dynamax means everyone else should do the same. And more specifically, Piers is against the idea of limiting Marnie to only follow in his footsteps. That itself is the crux of the conflict between Marnie and Piers that plays out when the player actually enters Spikemuth. Marnie feels extremely indebted to Piers for taking care of her, so she wants the world to look up to him the same way that she does. Thus, Marnie tries to adopt Piers' exact mindset and approach, which is specifically not what Piers wants her to do. Piers wants his sister to be herself, not an imitation of him. He wants Marnie to discover what defines her as a person, not dedicate herself to hyping him up. He doesn't really care if his specific legacy doesn't get carried down by her. He'd rather help Marnie cultivate her own legacy, one that isn't so tied to the struggles they faced in the rundown Spikemuth when growing up. Piers doesn't even really care about being a gym leader. He'd rather focus on his music. The simple fact that Marnie is so determined to be a battler in the first place is already proof enough that they are not the same person with the same mindset and motivations. As a side note, while not focused on Piers specifically, I did actually write a little piece about Marnie's character arc and how it progresses that touches on some of these ideas, which I might turn into its own video another day. Anyways, if you're paying attention, this is directly opposite to Rose's mindset and actions. Where Rose didn't care about anyone's legacy other than his own, Piers specifically wants his legacy to be something that might inspire what comes after him, but doesn't control what comes after him. And it all makes a lot more sense when you think about what Piers is meant to represent as a character. Piers' whole shtick is clearly inspired by punk rock aesthetics, most likely the punk movement in the UK specifically in the 70s. And the whole message of punk rock is specifically not limiting the youth to think only in the ways of the establishment. It's an anti-establishment movement for a reason. So it makes a lot of sense that Piers would want to emphasize Marnie's personal freedom and self-expression. Not to imitate him, but to express herself, to find herself, to make her own form of legacy. Compare that to Rose, who cared so little for Bede's legacy that he just threw him away the moment he did something that didn't align with what Rose wanted. The dynamic between Piers and Rose is one of a rebellious spirit pushing back against the establishment figurehead who doesn't want to let go of his position and influence. The fact that Rose is abusing his position and influence in a way that harms the environment is just the cherry on top here. As for people in power refusing to let go of their legacy, bet you didn't expect these jokers would be coming up in this sort of analysis either, did you? Well, contrary to popular belief, I also think Sordward and Shielbert are excellent antagonists for the themes of Sword and Shield's story, and I'm going to explain why briefly, and why they're important to help discern the point of Rose's character. To sum this up, all the major antagonists of Sword and Shield have one overarching thematic component, in that they in some way want to engrave their names and legacy into the future of the region. For some context, one of the ongoing subplots of the main campaign of Sword and Shield involved Sonya uncovering how the box legendaries, that being Zacian and Zamazenta, had their roles and actions in saving Galar from the Darkest Day warped to the point of stripping them of their legacy, instead propping up two humans, or one depending on the historical source. Sonya would later write a book detailing the proper history of what happened. Sordward and Shielbert are descendants of the original two humans that essentially stole the credit for saving the region, and thus want to stamp out Sonya's attempt to tell the true story. In doing so, they force-feed Galar particles to Zacian and Zamazenta, depending on the version of the game, in order to force them to rampage. And the idea here is that they couldn't be heroes of the region if they are wild beasts that are attacking everyone. Yeah, you heard that right. Sword and Shield has a subplot and entire post-game storyline about the negative impacts and motivations of historical revisionism, all while portraying the people who try to change history to suit their narrative as total snobby idiots that you're meant to make fun of. It's taking people who don't want real history to be taught, you know, a concept that is extremely relevant these days, and saying, these guys are stupid and you're meant to want to kick them in the teeth. And I'm meant to believe Sword and Shield doesn't have some of the best storytelling in the series, okay? Anyways, the reason I bring this up here is because the idea and obsession the brothers have with a particular concept. Legacy. I've already explained how this is basically the core theme of the entire game's story, and this is an example of that in practice. The other more positive role models of the game more so want to pass the torch onto the next generation, allowing them to find their own paths and take the world in a new direction. Meanwhile, Sordward and Shielbert's idea of legacy is entirely self-centered. They only want to be remembered as the descendants of heroes in order to maintain their status and popularity. And to be clear, it's not inherently wrong to want to be remembered, but much of the theme of Sword and Shield is that it's more important to focus on leaving something good behind for the next generation to build off from. Again, I went over all this with characters like Leon, Opal, Piers, and Sonya, all aiming to impart a good influence on the player, Bede, Marnie, and Hop respectively, and how this is reflected through the rest of the cast as well. They're trying to impart something onto people actually there in the region who can build off of those ideas. This is what Sordward and Shielbert lack. They don't want to help the future, they just want to benefit from the status they had with the legacy of their ancestors, even trying to cover up the lies that gave them that legacy to begin with. Now, why does this connect to Rose, you might ask? Well, that's because when you boil down the absolute essence of Rose's motivations and why he became so irrational to begin with, the primary thing he wanted in the end was the very same thing: to leave a legacy. It didn't matter to him if people thought he was crazy. It didn't matter to him if people died in the process. He wanted to leave his mark on history. He wanted to be remembered. His jealousy of Leon made him want to attain a level of status and legacy that far surpassed what Leon could ever have accomplished. Something that would have lasted 1,000 years into the future, well after Leon had been forgotten. Rose had given up on the idea of making the present day adore him to the level that he wanted, and so he instead opted to focus entirely on the future, on people that could still give him that legacy. What Rose really wanted was for people 1,000 years into the future to read about him in history textbooks as a genius who saved their world, and he didn't much care for how he achieved that, or how crazy it would seem at the time. To develop on a statement I made earlier, Rose didn't want to pass the torch. He didn't want someone other than himself to gain that legacy. He just wanted it all for himself. That's why he wanted Leon to bow down to his commands. Leon valued the final tournament battle higher than Rose's plan to save the future, and that angered Rose. Because, as something I've been building to explaining, Rose wanted his plan to be his ticket to leaving his mark on the world for centuries to come. Rose had completely failed to attain the legacy he wanted in the present. He failed to be a champion like his younger brother. He came in second place during his own gym challenge journey. And thus over time, he eventually turned into this desperate man, grasping for any kind of long-term relevancy. And what makes it so hard-hitting is that it's an understandable fear. One that I'm pretty sure every human being has dealt with at some point or is currently dealing with. That question of, who will remember us 100 years after we passed on? Sure, one's memories will carry them down a few generations, but that can only last so long. Not to scare anyone with the existentialism here, but 1,000 years from now, you, the person watching this, won't really be remembered by anyone. And even if you do achieve something great, there's almost no guarantee that your story will be preserved accurately. It might get warped in order to give someone else the credit that you deserved. Something directly showcased in how Zacian and Zamazenta almost became lost to history. They saved the entire region from the darkest evil it had ever faced. You can't get a much stronger legacy than that, but they were still largely forgotten to time until Sonya rediscovered them. And a lot of people are genuinely afraid of that happening to them. Especially those who subscribe to the mindset of Longtermism. And especially those who aim to leave a mark on the world and failed. If you fail at achieving your goals, what was really the point of all of that effort? What did your life amount to if not attaining that level of success? Which leads us to the next character that connects to Rose, one that I've been building to at many points across this analysis. Now, quick discretion here, Hop is borderline my favorite Pokemon character of all time, at least in terms of the games. I've already written a text analysis on why I adore his character, similar to how I did with Rose, and in the future I very well might rewrite that analysis and make it into a video script like I did with this one. So understand, I am very much holding back on detailing Hop's entire story and analysis, and just sticking to what's most relevant to this video. Yes, I am fully aware of how ridiculous it is every time I say I'm being light on detail in a script that's 17,000 words long, just roll with it. I don't think I need to get too much into the weeds here anyways. If you've been paying attention, you've already realized the very deliberate similarities between Rose and Hop. Even beyond the shared connection they have to Bede and Leon, there are numerous details about each character that are really obviously meant to make them mirrors of each other. They both have a brother who is champion and has a generally more upbeat attitude towards life. They both entered the gym challenge and got all the way to the finals of the tournament, only to come in second place. And while they had diverged as characters by this point, both Rose and Hop eventually found new callings in life outside of battling. It would in fact be very dishonest to claim that there wasn't an attempt made to make Rose and Hop clear parallels of each other. Not dissimilar to how Rose is a parallel to the player. That might sound confusing, but you can have one character parallel many different characters at once. In fact, that's a pretty common way to write a really good villain. There are in fact many thematic connections to make with this, the most notable being how Rose and Hop view Leon and the player respectively. Leon in many ways represents everything Rose wanted to become and failed. Rose failed to live up to his brother Peony. He failed to become champion. He failed to raise any protege and push the one he had away. Leon is the walking embodiment of everything that Rose isn't. And that's part of why he's so desperate to control Leon and have him bend to his whim. To make Leon's efforts into Rose's efforts. There's also the fact that Rose was Peony's older brother, just like Leon, further instilling the idea that Leon is a mirror to everything Rose wanted to be, but never became. Hop also failed to live up to his brother. He also failed to become champion. And we can see in the aftermath of the finals match with Hop, and especially in the post-game, that this hurts him. It hurts Hop to see all of his efforts to become a strong battler result in no tangible victory over the player. And do remember, Hop is no slouch when it comes to battles. He did come in second place after all, but coming in second means he isn't able to become the champion. And that was what Hop wanted. The player succeeds where Hop fails. The player represents everything Hop wanted to become and failed at. Just like Rose. So, what exactly is the game trying to say with this dynamic? What is the point in showing us how Rose and Hop initially went down paths that were nearly identical in many ways? Well, one could say, it's to emphasize how much Hop's ability to bond and connect with others saved him from failing to the same vices that Rose did. And further explains what inherently caused Rose to fall into that harmful and dangerous mindset, that lack of human connection. Hop was able to pick himself back up thanks to the connections he had with those around him, specifically Sonia. This was another person who failed to live up to her initial dreams, who saw Hop and was reminded of herself, and thus inspired him to take another path that was better for him. In fact, I could have made a whole other section of this video that detailed how Sonia and Rose are reflections of each other, because Sonia and Rose both looked up to Leon in some respect, and failed to become what he is. No, I'll just save that for another time anyways. But anyway, Sword and Shield is clearly a story about achieving your dreams, but also arguably just as much about what happens when you don't achieve your dreams. You can wallow in that failure and not do anything with your life, like Sonia did for many years before picking herself back up. You can find a new dream, a new passion to follow, like Hop did. Or you can desperately cling on to anything that will get you to that initial dream, never giving it up. Even if it means pushing people away, even if it means hurting others. That's what Rose did. And that is why he's the game's antagonist, as well as one of the best in Pokémon history. Despite everything I've said about comparing Rose to scummy elite CEOs, I do think it's important to note that Rose is not as malicious as most of that archetype. Rose's intentions are not evil. His personal failings and flaws as a human being corrupts his actions and turns them evil, but he himself is not an evil person. When I think of the type of faulty businessman that Rose is, I don't only think of most modern tech CEOs like your Elon Musks or the archetypical evil rich guy often presented in media. It is pretty funny to compare Rose to those kinds of characters, especially with how blatant the similarities have become in recent years. But no, when I think of Rose, I think of another character. A figure that persists as an iconic and scarily grounded portrayal of the dangers of excessive capitalism and greed. One from a classic story that people still re-experience fondly to this day. That character is the Onceler.
How bad can I be? I'm just building the economy. How bad?
No, not that one. Get him out of here. This one. The original Onceler from Dr. Seuss's timeless story, The Lorax. The story of the Onceler is tragic in how true it is to life. A man with a genuine desire to try and improve the world with his invention makes his first big success, and then becomes blinded by the pursuit of greater and greater success that he doesn't see the damage he's causing to the world around him until it's too late. He's very much the antagonist of the story, but what makes the Onceler so compelling to look back on, and a large part of what makes the Lorax so timeless in the first place, is the fact that the Onceler could be anyone. He has no tragic backstory, no dramatic heel turn that's meant to justify his actions, and his lack of foresight into the damage he ends up causing is born from personal vices that apply to anyone. This is very clearly blatantly similar to Rose, yada yada, you've heard this before. But the reason I bring up this comparison, beyond the fact that it presents greater depth to see Rose from this perspective, is the fact that it helps clarify why Rose's humanity is so important to his character. I presented Rose as a commentary on the way people in positions of power can cause great harm due to the fact that despite having that much power, they're still human beings, susceptible to the flaws that come with being human. Rose is a dark mirror of the exact type of person Hop could have become, the type of person the player could have become. His goofy traits aren't just there to make you laugh. They're there to remind you that even someone silly like Rose is capable of falling to irrationality. In fact, bring back that other guy for a second. People criticize the 2012 Lorax film's portrayal of the Onceler, not necessarily because he's a poor character, guy's got a great fashion sense, that's for sure, but because by giving this version of the Onceler a deeper reason for falling, being his cruel and cartoonishly evil family, it misses so much of the point of the original. The Onceler makes the mistakes he does because he's a regular person with regular flaws, not because of something outside of his control like an evil family. The scale of the damage his mistakes cause is vast, even if the reason he made those mistakes are small. This is why I just can't understand or agree with the people who say that Rose's character would have been better if he had a, quote, bigger reason to fall the way he did. To me, that would be akin to what the 2012 Lorax film did to the Onceler, making it easy to excuse the character's outlandish actions by giving him an outlandish environment to blame it on, instead of acknowledging the admittedly somewhat scary fact that sometimes people are just that irrational, even those with power, especially those with power sometimes. Like I said, this criticism has largely fallen out of favor, but there was a time where people would criticize Rose in the basis of, oh, Rose's irrationality doesn't make sense because if he was this irrational the whole time, how could he become a big tech CEO? Which obviously doesn't make sense as a criticism because you can be someone in a position of power and still be irrational and stupid with how you use that power. I say all this because I want to re-emphasize that the reasons I adore Rose as a character is because all of his traits, both his flaws and his qualities, are presented in an extremely human and relatable light. It's why I think he's a stronger written villain than the others Pokemon has given us. Because while they might have a stronger presence, it's also a lot easier and less challenging to engage with them as villains. Not challenging from a gameplay perspective, you know what I mean. It's easy to look at someone like Getsis and just lump him as an evil and power-hungry person, with no sense of humanity or nuance to him. It's even easy to look at someone like Cyrus and go, oh, his evil actions are explained by his tragic upbringing that we never get to see. It's a lot more challenging, and thus a lot more interesting, with a villain like Rose. Someone who, as far as he's presented in the games, has no such tragic backstory. Someone who, let's be real, doesn't even really come across like a bad guy when you first meet him. Just look at his design compared to most Pokemon villains. Even next to fellow suit wearer Giovanni, Rose just does not give the same level of evil intimidation. He lacks both the tragic justification and the overwhelmingly evil presence of other Pokemon villains. And that's exactly why he's so compelling. Because anyone in his position could fall to the same vices that he does. And in many respects, that's why so many people disregard the writing behind him. Because again, it can be difficult to acknowledge that a seemingly completely chill person can do something so destructive. Much like the Onceler, Rose isn't some cartoonishly evil person. He's not some caricature of villainy. He's just a guy. A guy who wanted to enrich the world in some way, but whose very human vices, specifically his jealousy and lack of ability to communicate with others, caused him to become blind to the negatives of what he was doing. And even further is how this ties into the themes of the Lorax as a narrative. In particular, its ending. Spoilers, I guess, for a story that's over half a century old, but the original Lorax is told from the perspective of the Onceler himself, recounting the events that led to the demise of the forest. He tells this story to just some random boy who happened to stop by. And the reason he does so is pretty simple. He's giving his story as a lesson to those that come after him. A parable to prevent them from making the same mistakes that he made. The Onceler knows that he wasn't a special case. He knows that people in the future could be doomed to repeat history if they don't learn from it. But most relevant of all, the Onceler knows that he can only entrust the act of fixing the world to those in the future. He can provide them with knowledge and history so they can learn from what came before, but beyond that, his role is done. It's up to those that he gives those tools to in order to make the world a better place. This is very notable because it's the precise lesson that Rose refused to learn until the end of the game. He refused to let anyone else take responsibility for fixing the problems of the future. He wanted to save everyone in the future now, by himself, with no one else telling him what to do or where to stop. And once again, that's where he and Leon differ. Leon, being the bastion of the present, knows that he eventually has to entrust his role to future generations. As he says in his speech when the player defeats him. He knows he can't control what happens in the future, so all he can do is best prepare the ones who will be tasked with taking on the tribulations that the future brings. Where Rose tossed away his protege, Leon did his best to pass the torch on to his. And this, in many ways, is represented by the mere existence of the Gym Challenge. The Gym Challenge in Sword and Shield is core to everything the game aims to say with its messages. It's the driving force for the player and their rivals, but it's also a coalition of what the game means when it asserts the importance of legacy. Giving young people the motivation to step up in the world, to challenge the old guard, to foster rivalries, helping people who have lost their drive to find it again. The Gym Challenge does all of those things. It directly represents legacy and the passing of the torch and how it should be done. Rose disregarding the Gym Challenge is not just an aspect of his plan. It's emblematic of the fact that he lost sight of all of those things. He didn't want to foster the next generation to match or surpass him. He wanted to be this insurmountable success that would never be forgotten. It's in many regards a criticism of long-termism as a mindset. That this hyperfixation on the future can blind you to what matters most. The present. Those who are currently alive matter more than those who have yet to come. Instead of thinking only about what's beyond, you have to leave things for the people who are here and will live on after you. Your story can only exist as an inspiration for the stories that directly follow. After that, its role is done. Leon understands this concept implicitly. He was able to let go of his status when he lost, leaving the door open for the next champion to rise in his place. And as an aside, it's interesting how this somewhat ties into Sword and Shield's development as a game, as many of the old guard staff and developers who worked on most prior Pokemon games began to step down starting with the 8th generation, making way for a new generation of creatives with new ideas for the franchise. So, the actual villain of Sword and Shield is, you could say, the refusal to allow the next generation to take care of itself. Rose is the arbiter of that concept, in how he threw away any chance of being that inspiration for the future in favor of his own legacy. And it's also why Leon is so crucially important to the game's themes and narrative. He fully represents how important being an inspiration is, while Rose is in full denial of that. Most villains have a line of logic that's meant to justify their actions if to no one else but themselves. And the thing that makes them villains in the first place is when they take that line of existing logic and twist it to the point where it becomes harmful to others. And this twisting is compelling when it's caused by that villain's personal human vices. The flaws in who they are that causes them to see the world in a warped way, causing any rationality to leave them. That's how you write a strong, morally nuanced villain. Because again, you can have an antagonist who's evil for the sake of being evil, or even just a villain who says he has a deeper motivation, but doesn't develop it that much due to their character being more of a plot device. But Rose is a morally nuanced villain, where he's written to be a normal person whose motivations got twisted because of his normal person flaws. So as I start, I think, to get to the ending portion of this video, let's reorient this conversation around what I think should be pretty clear is the core theme of Sword and Shield as a narrative: legacy. How is this the main theme? Have you been watching the video up to this point? I've repeated it like 17 times in the script. It's crazy. I need a thesaurus. Well, as I've gone over in extensive detail, every primary character in the game is in some way centrally focused on the future or are otherwise defined by their relationship to the future. Hop struggles to find the path that he thought was meant for him and finds a new one. Sonia achieves something after struggling for so long with her failures in the past and uses that to help another follow in her footsteps. Opal wants to pass the torch of her mentality and attitude and aesthetic onto someone that she deems as worthy. Bede is so centered on trying to be useful to someone who helped him in the past until his eyes are opened into pursuing his own future. Milo goes easy on his opponents so that they can grow to become stronger. Kabu once lost his passion for battling and settled for the minor league at some point, but after finding his passion again, he strives to be an example for his peers. Across Sword and Shield, there's also this constant idea of progression for the most important characters. Marnie and Bede become gym leaders, Sonia becomes a professor, and the player becomes champion. While other games in the series sometimes have their characters advance in some way, Sword and Shield is the only one where that's a consistent theme across the entire cast. Every single rival in the game is in an explicitly different position than when they were at the start, which is not usually the case for Pokemon rivals. I could go on, but the overall point is simple. Looking to the future and passing the torch and leaving a legacy are important ideas across all of Sword and Shield's cast, especially for Rose. As we've established, over the course of the game, we see Rose lose pieces of his humanity as his obsession with his plan grows and grows. By the time of the encounter on Rose Tower, he's officially become so set on his plan that he's completely lost any ability to have his mind changed by Leon. As we read from his league card, he's been historically unable to communicate well with others over his life, and therefore was likely never able to form fulfilling relationships with a lot of people. That's why his plan has so little regard for the people living in the now. And what exactly is the core of that plan? What makes it so hard to understand for Leon and most players? Simple. Rose is looking into the future. And only into the future. Once again, Rose has adopted a long-termism mindset. And while a long-termism mindset isn't necessarily evil, twisting it to the point where Rose does is evil. Rose legitimately does not care a single bit about the people living in present-day Galar. He says as much himself. He only cares about the future. A future that could be under threat, according to him. And so anything, literally anything that could even remotely prevent saving that future as soon as possible, regardless of how small or petty, regardless of how much it impacts the people around him in the present, anything at all, is to Rose just an obstacle that's in the way. The Darkest Day? That's just a worthwhile sacrifice of the people of Galar's present in order to ensure Galar's future. Anything getting in the way of that is just delaying progress to him. Rose is so close-mindedly fixated on the future that he has absolutely completely lost sight of the present. And again, this is something that's slowly but surely built up over the course of the game. His dismissal of Bede, his disregard for the lives he endangers with his experiments, and now his complete and total desire to forego the league finals. All of that is an example of him losing any and all empathy for the people in the present. Because in reality, the future does not wait. It doesn't care for what happens in the present and will constantly approach, regardless of how fair or logical it may seem. Rose is the embodiment of the future. Or he sees himself as the embodiment of the future. We'll get to that a bit more later. But it is fitting given his status as the one whose innovations brought Galar to such a state of progress. And what makes this even more clear is through the person Rose is speaking to when he's on that tower. Leon. Because just as Rose sees himself as the embodiment of an uncaring and constantly approaching future, Leon is the embodiment of the lived-in present. Leon is a guy who, in stark contrast to Rose, only thinks of the terms of here and now. He's never really concerned about what happens next. All he cares about is living in the moment, wherever he is at that time. And in a goofy way, this is explained by one of his famous defects, his pants sense of direction. What better way to represent a character being fixated only on where he is, and never on where he's going, than to make him terrible at finding his next destination? And really, that's all the proof I would need to demonstrate that this is a very intentional trait they placed on Leon to work with the themes of the game. However, there is more in his character that demonstrates this, mainly in how much he adores Pokemon battles, and specifically the way he enjoys them. Battles are the one thing Leon cares about more than anything else, and he lives for the feeling of being in the heat of a battle. That's his champion time.
Well, sometimes I can't honestly tell if he wants to win or to lose.
He doesn't care about what happens at the end of a match, only that he's in one. And it's in this way that Leon directly conflicts with Rose's ideology, similar to how I mentioned with Piers. Rose represents what he sees as a fixation on the future, while Leon represents a fixation on the present. This is why they can't come to any kind of understanding, even through the supposedly hundreds of conversations that Rose and Leon have had. Because to Leon, and us by extension, Rose being so unwilling to wait until later to enact his plan makes no sense. It's intentionally a very flawed and irrational mindset, but also a very human one. And likewise to Rose, Leon's inability to put something as trivial as the league finals on hold for something as important as the immediate securing of the region's future makes no sense. At least to him. Rose has built up this idea that his plan is more important than anything else the region could be focusing on right now. Leon brings up the people of present-day Galar, how important this moment is for them. Rose rebuttals by bringing up the people of Galar's future, how they must take priority given the circumstances they're likely to be in. Again, circumstances that Rose doesn't really have a lot of proof for. And the two just can't reconcile these differences in any way, with Leon only begrudgingly coming to what he sees as a compromise, when really it's just what he wants taking precedence over what Rose wants. Having the league finals take place before Rose's plan is specifically what Rose doesn't want. He wants his plan and enacting it and saving the region's future to be the thing that everyone pays attention to. This moment here, this ideological and thematic struggle between two opposed mindsets that, at their core, are both based in the logic that these two people have come to over their lives. This is one of the most compelling back and forths I've seen in a Pokemon game story, especially to analyze. Just two people with vastly different ideas about what matters most in the world, trying to convince each other to act in accordance to their mindset. In other Pokemon stories, while they were loosely sympathetic opposing ideologies, none of them were given a ton of development or rationale. They just stood as motivations and little else. Ultimately, you could remove those motivations from most of them, and their impact and contribution to the story and themes would largely be the same. Take Team Plasma, for example. Their goal of wanting to liberate Pokemon while having a semblance of a good argument in there is explicitly a lie by Ghetsis, who just wants to take over the world. And make no mistake, Rose isn't the good guy here, or a good guy at all. He's being completely unreasonable and trying to enforce his ideas onto everyone else, despite how unnecessarily dangerous they are, and despite how flawed his logic is if you really pay attention. But I just find that it's far more interesting and nuanced here because I can actually understand where Rose is coming from. I can sympathize with why he feels the way he does, even if he's taking his ideas too far. There are absolutely people in our current day who think in a similar way to Rose. People who only care about the result, who only care about what the future holds and will take drastic and often incredibly self-destructive actions for the sake of reaching that future. And I can see people so frustrated in the fact that they can't properly communicate why they think the way they do to others, making them feel trapped in their own mind, unable to see their thought process from an outside view, and thus going to further and further extremes. This aspect of Rose is foreshadowed right from the beginning when you get his first league card, stating that he has trouble communicating his ideas to others, like I said. Imagine that for a moment, living a life where no one seems to understand you. When you also become upset, feel like you need to take drastic measures just to get people to understand where you're coming from, feel trapped, in a sense. One of my favorite lines from Rose that I think goes rather underlooked, and is something I've referenced before already, is after the player beats him before going up to face Eternatus. Rose comments that Leon coming to his aid is like a knight in shining armor coming to save a princess from a dragon. It's an interesting analogy for Rose to be making here, one that makes me want to analyze what he means by this, and what the game means by having him say this. Rose sees himself as a damsel trapped by Eternatus, the dragon in this analogy. Trapped likely because he feels obligated to be the one to utilize its incredible power after being the one who initially discovered it. But also trapped because he thinks that no one else can fully understand why he has to do this, or why he feels he has to do this. Rose wanted to embody this idea of progress and good change in the world. But in order to do so to the extent he wanted, in order to attain that legacy he was so desperate for, he lost the trust and empathy he had for others at the beginning in favor of a cold, purely technical approach. Much like in that instance with Bede, he's disregarding the humanity of the situation, not even thinking of a way to make a compromise, because he's trying to think of this from a completely unemotional, unhuman perspective. He went from this very human, goofy presence to looking at things as coldly and technically as a robot. In his mind, the Gym Challenge Finals won't save Galar from its energy crisis. It won't concretely assure the safety of the people of the region for hundreds of generations into the future. So why should it take precedent over something that will? And the answer is simple. It's human nature. Humans will naturally choose present-day enjoyment over doing work that might benefit them in the future. And the thing that people who abide by long-termism mindsets don't really get a lot of the time is that helping yourself in the present is helping yourself for the future. Because making sure that you're okay, making sure that you have people around you, and making sure that your environment can actually sustain itself for the immediate future is just as, if not more important, than making it ready for a future 1,000 years from now. This is what Leon represents, as I said. The game presents him as the unmoving force of the here and now, the present. Someone far more focused on what's happening today, at this very moment. Which contrasts with Rose being fixated on the future, and him wanting to save a time and a place that he does not exist in. Even with all that I said about Rose's flaws, none of that means that he was necessarily wrong on every single account. It's the fact that the game doesn't demonize the ideology that Rose holds, how it shows a more full picture of why and how he is the way he is, and gives so many little details that add a world of nuance and layers to his actions that make me see him as so much more compelling than the other antagonists of the series. Again, it's about making the villain feel human. Not necessarily sympathetic, but understandable. And my favorite moment of this in effect is in his battle with the player at the climax of the game. As stated, battles and enjoyment of them is a huge part of Leon's mindset and why he focuses on the present as much as he does. Which makes this battle with Rose interesting, because we're finally seeing him engage in this act that Leon defined himself by. We see him look at his Pokeball, almost as if he's doubting himself a bit before throwing it with resolve. And the music playing hammers this home even further, as the chorus is chanting "I believe in Rose" in Latin over and over again. It's like a chilling representation of what's going on through Rose's brain. Like he's constantly trying to reassure himself. I'm correct. I'm correct. They believe in me, so I must be the hero here. He's placed himself in a position of power where people are at his beck and call. People who believe in him. People who think that he is truly that great. He has the power of Eternatus right before him. He doesn't even really care about battling the player at this point. He just does so out of obligation. As he said himself, he's becoming not the valiant knight who strides off to defeat the dragon and save the kingdom, but the damsel princess stuck in the castle waiting to be rescued. And he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to feel trapped by his own position. He wants to be the destined savior of the region. And he won't stop aiming for that until his goal is achieved. But then he loses. And then he smiles. Because he genuinely enjoyed himself battling the player. His plan is falling apart before his eyes, and yet he's happy here. And while this doesn't become clear until after the game is said and done, we hear that Rose turned himself into the authorities without really any resistance. Some might see that as a shallow capitulation, but to me it proves that, at least for the time being, Rose understands where he went wrong. That battle changed him. This is Rose finally shifting over into Leon's mindset, or at least a version of it. Him seeing that living in the present is in fact just as, if not more important, than fighting for the future. And he just lets you go up to fix the mess he created, later turning himself in for his crimes. It's him regaining some of the humanity that he had lost beforehand. And a part of me just loves that. I've always found it a bit weird how, in a lot of Pokemon games, losing the battle meant the bad guy just had to give up, even if it didn't make much sense logistically. Giovanni didn't need to give up the Silph Scope just because he lost to a 10-year-old, and this logic applies to a lot of the Pokemon villains after their scuffles, even some of the better ones. But with Rose, it's different. You didn't stop his plan by defeating him. You showed him the joy of Pokemon battles. Showed him what he was missing in his closed-mindedness. Showed him what his jealousy was blinding him to. And at least on some level, it seems like that is what drove him to give up his plans even after Eternatus had been captured like he wanted. He simply didn't want to engage with that ideology anymore. I don't know, I just feel like there's something special about the simple joy of Pokemon battles being the thing that convinces the antagonist that his ways are wrong, instead of this nebulous idea that we were fighting to stop them. And this ability to be changed just goes to show how much more human Rose is compared to the other Pokemon antagonists. Hell, most other Pokemon characters for that matter. His motivations aren't just something to facilitate a bad guy conflict throughout the game. That's why losing a Pokemon battle is enough to make him not want to pursue his plan anymore. We didn't stop Rose, we convinced him that he was wrong. Really, this is one of the few Pokemon villain conflicts that feels like it was made with the unique premise of Pokemon battles in mind. In regular JRPGs, you could say the villain died after being fought, but here it's more about changing his mind. Rose's motivations are derived from his opinions. Opinions that we get explanations for and build up towards. Opinions that have flawed logic derived from stated and understandable personal defects. And moreover, Rose's opinions can and are impacted by his experiences, much like the opinions of any human being. And honestly, I just find that to be so much more compelling and interesting than anything the other Pokemon antagonists have offered. I know Rose's story isn't perfectly handled, especially in presentation, many things could have been improved. But in terms of just making him to be a compelling character, I've never been so intrigued by a main antagonist in Pokemon as I am with Rose. Because he isn't just a plot device, he's a human being, a fleshed out character. The plot could realistically work without him there, but he is there, for good reason, because he perfectly encapsulates the themes the game is going for. His actions and the scenes focused on him are never meant to simply just make him feel more intimidating, to make him a cooler boss to fight. It's never just to move the plot forward. Leon handles that area fairly well already. No, Rose's scenes are meant to be thought about, to be analyzed, and characters that give me stuff to think about and analyze are my favorite kinds of characters, bar none. I'd much rather have a character that challenges my perceptions of what a villain can be, like Rose, than have one that, fits the mold of a villain better, like, say, Giovanni. It's what makes Rose easily my favorite of the mainline Pokemon antagonists. Because I like seeing the humanity in people, rather than boiling them down to simple acts of good or evil. And that's why I appreciate the humanity of Chairman Rose. Yeah, so I was initially going to end off on that prior segment, and the section I'm about to get into, that was initially meant for earlier in the video, and the part analyzing the characters surrounding Rose. But I decided to move this part here to the end, because it felt more appropriate to end off on, especially since I wanted this part to stick out more. Was I right in that assessment? Maybe, maybe not. I'll let you be the judge. But now, let's talk about Oleana. For the longest time making this analysis, I was trying to figure out how Oleana fit into this dynamic with Rose. She's obsessively loyal to him, sure, but it was difficult to tell what exactly her character's story was meant to say about Rose's actions, beyond the idea of him being, just inconsiderate to her. But then it hit me. Now, bear with me, because, again, I'm admittedly having to break a few of my self-imposed rules with this analysis and draw upon side material that isn't really present in the games. Specifically, I'm going to draw upon the 5th Twilight Wings episode dedicated to Oleana. Unlike most of the other things I've talked about in this video, you can't really say that what's in this episode is directly showcased in Sword and Shield itself, or even really implied, which is why I didn't initially want to comment on it, because I wanted to focus more on stuff you can derive from Sword and Shield's base game alone. That said, this episode's exploration of Oleana's background and why she follows Rose so loyally does say a lot about their dynamic that is very present in the game. To the point where I really wouldn't feel right in not including it in some capacity, especially if I was going to talk about Oleana in any sense. So here we are. In the episode, we see that Oleana used to be a researcher with a lot of self-confidence issues. She wasn't valued by those around her much, and thus found it difficult to find value in herself. That is until Rose came by one day. Rose looked at Oleana, looked at her diligence and her research, and he saw value in it. For once, Oleana's talents were being acknowledged by someone. And furthermore, they were being put to good use, as she became Rose's secretary and in charge of many of his assets. Watching this episode, especially the quiet moments of intimacy the two share, and then looking back at the characters in the game with its context, it really changes how one views Oleana and Rose's dynamic. Oleana isn't just a case of a villain's henchwoman obsessing over them. She's the evidence of the good that does exist inside of Rose. A reminder of the fact that, no matter what he does, Rose is still human. Rose saw value in Oleana's outlook and her personality, even when no one else around her did. And even as he goes off the deep end, betrays those around him, pushes people away, Oleana sees the good in what he's trying to do. She's doing for Rose, in many ways, the same thing that he did for her. Even as people view him as a criminal who almost destroyed the region over petty jealousy and irrationality, Oleana sees the good sides of him that do exist. And hey, if you want stuff that's reinforced in the game, both of Rose's League cards enforce this idea in their text because both of them were written by Oleana herself. In the first League card, Oleana writes that she's the one who fully understands what his intentions are. And in what may be perhaps a nod to how that expectation was portrayed by the climax of the game, in the second League card, Oleana writes, "For better or worse, it's Rose's style of leadership that has allowed the Macros Cosmos conglomerate to grow to where it is today." For better or worse. Keep in mind that this card was given to you by Oleana when you find her after the credits of the game, after everything with Rose went down in the climax. And while most of the second card is still stubbornly extolling Rose's virtues, that little additional comment and the general acknowledgement in the second card does demonstrate that Oleana is fully aware of that, at the very least, Rose is a difficult person to understand. But in essence, that's why she follows him and why she cherishes him. Because she's also difficult to understand. But Rose understood her regardless. It's an odd note to end on for both of these two. Rose disappearing from prison and Oleana going off in search of him. But I suppose an odd ending is fitting for two rather odd people. And in a sense, it's kind of a happy ending for both of them, isn't it? As I said earlier, one thing that's not commonly addressed in terms of people who gain as much wealth as Rose did is how having that wealth makes it next to impossible for them to understand and be understood by those around them. It makes it close to impossible to form that human connection with others that we all need. But even having lost all of that, lost that empathy, having betrayed the trust and undermined the respect of those around him, Rose still has someone who sees value in him. The very person who he saved by seeing value in her. He still has that human connection. So yeah, Pokemon villains are kind of weird. But I think Rose is pretty neat.